The needle was still warm. That was the detail Fleet Commander Voss Ethereal couldn't reconcile. Standing inside the wreckage of Observation Post 7, surrounded by the frozen bodies of 43 of his finest tactical analysts, surrounded by the silent aftermath of what his instruments insisted had been a clean, decisive victory, the needle was still warm. It was human-made, small, crude by any galactic standard, a thin filament of pressed metal, barely 4 centimeters long, attached to nothing, connected to nothing, sitting in the center of the debris field as though it had been placed there deliberately. Every piece of Voss's tactical training told him it was irrelevant. Detritus, the meaningless litter of a primitive civilization that hadn't understood what was about to happen to them. But it was warm, and nothing else in the room was. He picked it up with 2 fingers, feeling the faint residual heat transfer through his exoskeletal gloves, and he stood very still for a long moment while his second-in-command recited casualty numbers behind him. The Armada had been in human space for 6 hours. 6 hours of what the Strategic Council had promised would be a 3-day campaign of systematic pacification. The humans had no faster-than-light weapons, no coherent orbital defense grid, no unified command structure capable of responding to a simultaneous multi-vector engagement. They had needles. Warm ones. Sir, his second-in-command, Subcommander Reith Avalan, stepped forward. The ground teams are reporting something unusual at coordinates 47, 9, 12. Voss didn't look up from the needle. Define unusual. Reith paused. That pause lasted half a second longer than protocol allowed. They're not sure how to classify it. The Armada of the Dominion Conclave had not lost a campaign in 400 years. This was not pride. It was arithmetic. The Conclave had catalogued 712 intelligent species across the Orion Cygnus arm of the galaxy, had engaged in armed conflict with 31 of those species, and had successfully absorbed every single one into the Conclave's administrative framework within a projected timeline. The average pacification period was 17 days. The record was 4. Earth had been assessed at 11 days. Generous, some on the Strategic Council had argued. The humans were pre-unified, politically fractured, armed with chemical propellant projectile weapons and short-range orbital debris. Their most advanced space program had placed several dozen individuals on their own moon, and then, remarkably, had largely stopped going. The Conclave's Intelligence Bureau had filed the preliminary assessment with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. Category 7 civilization. Aggressive territorial instincts but self-limiting in scope. No demonstrated capacity for interspecies cooperation. Significant internal conflict history suggesting psychological fragmentation incompatible with coordinated resistance. Recommend pacification window, 11 days. Approve asymmetric engagement doctrine. The Strategic Council had approved it in the same session. They approved the repainting schedule for 2 administrative stations near the Vila border. Earth had been, in the most literal sense, an afterthought. Voss had commanded the Armada anyway, because someone had to, and because he was good at his job, and because 11 days in the Orion Arm was not an unpleasant posting. He had planned to spend the middle days reviewing manuscripts. He had brought 3 of them. He had not opened a single page. "Show me coordinates 47, 9, 12, he said, and finally looked up from the needle. The feed from the ground team took 11 seconds to establish. Standard lag for surface-to-fleet relay through a contested ionosphere. Voss watched the static resolve into an image, and then watched his ground team commander, Senior Strike Captain Dara Vell, standing at the edge of what appeared to be an enormous open field. Behind her, extending to the horizon in both directions, was a line. Not a military line, not a fortification, not a weapon emplacement. A line of humans. They were standing still, unarmed as far as Dara's instruments could confirm. They were simply standing there in a field in a line that stretched beyond the sensor range of the camera, which meant it stretched beyond what Voss's mind initially allowed him to process. He adjusted the display parameters, reoriented the satellite overlay, cross-referenced the population density data from the pre-campaign survey. The line was approximately 40 kilometers long. There were roughly 600,000 humans in it. They were holding something, but the resolution wasn't clean enough to identify what. "What are they holding?" Voss asked. Dara's voice came back through the relay. "We're working on confirmation, sir. Initial scan suggests personal effects, photographs, written objects. Some appear to be holding hands." Silence on the bridge. Reith spoke very carefully. "Is it a surrender formation?" "Unknown," Dara said. "They're not carrying white flags. They're not carrying anything that reads as a signal of any kind. They're just standing there." "In a line," Voss said. "In a line, sir." Voss looked at the needle in his hand again. Then he looked at the line of 600,000 people standing in an open field, unarmed, holding photographs and letters in each other's hands, and he felt the very first tremor of something that his species didn't have a precise word for. In the Conclave's administrative language, the closest approximation would have translated, roughly, as the sensation that you are about to misunderstand something in a way that cannot be undone. "Hold all ground advance," he said. "Do not engage that position." Reith stiffened. "Sir, holding advance compromises our eastern sector timeline." "Hold it," Voss said. He kept looking at the line. He kept thinking about the needle. He had the growing, irrational, completely unscientific conviction that these two things were connected. That the warm needle in his hand and the 600,000 people standing in a field were part of the same sentence, and that the Armada had only just read the first word of it. The first misinterpretation happened 20 minutes later, and it happened because Dara's team was good at their jobs. They advanced cautiously, as ordered, not toward the line in the field Voss had held that, but toward a cluster of structures 3 kilometers east that the pre-campaign survey had identified as a regional administrative center. The buildings were intact. No evidence of evacuation. Power readings were nominal, which was unusual given that the Armada's initial strike package had targeted every regional power distribution node on the eastern seaboard. "Power's still on," one of Dara's team reported. "Local generation. They've got local generation." This made sense. The Conclave's intelligence had noted human redundancy infrastructure as a minor tactical consideration. They had planned for it. What they had not planned for was what Dara's team found inside the administrative building when they breached the main entrance. People working. Not hiding, not surrendering, not armed and waiting. Working. 47 humans, seated at stations, operating equipment, writing on physical documents with physical pens, speaking quietly into communication devices, completely ignoring the armed Conclave strike team that had just broken through their primary entrance with enough force to collapse a section of the exterior wall. One of them, a human female, middle-aged by the biological markers, wearing a garment with an insignia on the shoulder that Dara's translation matrix identified as emergency management, looked up from her desk, looked at Dara and said, with complete and devastating calm, "Can you tell your people to go around the east corridor? We've got a supply chain running through there and we don't need the bottleneck." Dara's team stopped moving. "She's asking us," one of them said quietly through the internal channel, "to use the other hallway." Dara stared at the woman. "You understand that we are an occupying force?" The woman nodded, already looking back at her documents. "I understand that you think you are." That sentence traveled up the chain of command in approximately 4 minutes. Voss read it twice. He sat with it for a moment and then said, quietly to no one in particular, "What does she think we are?" No one answered because no one knew. This was misinterpretation number 1. The conclave concluded that the humans working in the administrative building were in shock. Psychological dissociation was a documented response to overwhelming force. The conclave's behavioral science division had an entire subchapter on it. Category 7 civilizations occasionally produced individuals who simply could not process the scale of what was happening to them and defaulted to routine behavior as a coping mechanism. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. The second misinterpretation began building around Hour 3, and it started with a sound. Throughout the Armada's advance across the eastern seaboard, teams kept reporting the same anomaly. Music. Not recorded music, live music. Individual humans in structures in open spaces, sometimes alone and sometimes in groups, playing instruments or singing. One team reported a single elderly human male sitting on a collapsed portion of his home's exterior wall playing a stringed instrument, apparently unconcerned with the conclave strike team passing 50 meters in front of him. Are they performing rituals? One of Voss's analysts asked. Pre-sacrifice, appeasement behavior. It was the most logical framework available. 26 of the 31 species the conclave had previously engaged displayed some form of ritual behavior under existential threat. Offerings, prayers, ceremonial gatherings meant to invoke protection from supernatural agency. The humans singing fit the pattern well enough. The conclave filed it as Category 7 spiritual response, flagged for the cultural integration team, and moved on. They were wrong about that too. But deeper than the music, deeper than the working administrators and the warm needle, there was a third thing that Voss had noticed and hadn't yet told his command staff about. Because he didn't have language for it. Because it violated 7 different probability models simultaneously. In the 6 hours since the Armada's arrival, the conclave had engaged approximately 34 separate human military units across the theater of operations. 34 engagements, all conclave victories, all resolved within the expected parameters. But the human units had not retreated. Any of them. Not a single one. In 34 engagements against a force that outmatched them technologically, by a factor the conclave systems had rounded up to overwhelming. Not one human military unit had broken formation and run. Some had died in position. Some had been captured. A few had shifted tactics, flanking, dispersal, hit-and-run harassment, but even those had shifted toward the Armada, not away from it. The conclave's engagement models had a clear predictive framework for how inferior forces behaved under overwhelming opposition. That framework had been built on 712 species worth of data. Every single data point said, when facing destruction, rational beings preserve themselves. The humans weren't doing that. They're not running, Voss said to Reith, in the quiet of the command deck, after reviewing the 34th engagement report. No, sir. Why aren't they running? Reith was quiet for a moment. He was a good officer. He didn't give Voss comfortable answers when he didn't have them. I don't know, sir. Find out, Voss said. Because if they're not running, it's either because they can't or because they know something we don't. He didn't say which option frightened him more. He didn't have to. The answer, when it came from the wrong direction entirely. At Hour 5, a conclave intelligence operative named Assessor Thane Morak, a civilian, not military, assigned to the campaign purely to conduct preliminary cultural integration groundwork, filed an urgent report that cut the standard chain of command and landed directly in Voss's queue. This alone was remarkable. Assessors did not file urgent reports. Assessors filed careful, footnoted, hedged documents weeks after the fact, full of qualifications and conditional statements and departmental citations. Thane Morak had filed a 3-sentence urgent report. It read, I have reviewed the human communication network intercepts from the past 6 hours, specifically the civilian channels. Commander Ethereal, the humans are not talking about the invasion. Voss read it 3 times. Then he pulled up the intercepts himself. This was the moment, this specific moment, at hour 5 of a 6-hour campaign, when Fleet Commander Voss Ethereal began to understand that the Armada had made a fundamental error. Not a tactical error, not a strategic miscalculation. Something deeper, something that did not have a name in the Conclave's administrative language, though it would need one by the time this was over. The human-civilian communication networks, their information distribution infrastructure, their social coordination channels, everything the Conclave had expected to be flooded with panic, with surrender negotiations, with desperate appeals for mercy, were almost entirely silent on the subject of the invasion. Not because the humans didn't know about it. They knew. It was on every channel they had. The silence was a choice. Instead, the civilian networks were full of something else entirely. Logistics, supply chains, coordination protocols, but not military ones, civilian ones. Food distribution, medical resource allocation, shelter arrangements. And underneath all of it, woven through the data like a structural wire Voss had completely failed to notice until Thane Morek had pointed at it, was a pattern that made no tactical sense at all. The humans were taking care of each other. In the middle of an invasion by a force they had no capability to defeat militarily, they had apparently, collectively, without central coordination, without a command structure issuing orders, simply decided to make sure no one in their civilization went hungry or untreated or alone during the next however many days this took. The line of 600,000 people in the field, they hadn't been a military formation, they hadn't been a ritual. They had been. Voss pulled the visual data again, stared at it with new eyes, a supply line. They had been passing resources hand to hand. Food, medicine, equipment. 60 kilometers of human beings standing in a field, unarmed, not because they were waiting to fight and not because they were performing a ceremony, but because someone had figured out that it was the fastest way to move supplies to a region the Armada had cut off from vehicle transit. Reith, Voss said, and his voice was very quiet. Sir, how long would it take to organize 600,000 people into a line? Reith's mandibles shifted. With our coordination technology and a full command staff, 6 to 8 hours perhaps. How long ago did we arrive? 6 hours, sir. The implication sat between them in silence. The humans had organized this before the Armada had even begun its initial strike package. They had anticipated the supply line disruption, planned for it, and mobilized 600,000 civilian volunteers into a coordinated logistics chain before the first Conclave ship had crossed their atmosphere. They knew we were coming, Reith said slowly. They knew exactly what we would do, Voss said, and they weren't planning to fight it. They were planning to survive it. Which meant, and here was the thought that Voss turned over very carefully, the way you turn over a stone when you aren't sure what's underneath. The military engagements hadn't been the human response to the invasion. The military units that refused to retreat, the 34 engagements, the human soldiers who died in position rather than run, those hadn't been the main effort. They had been a distraction. What Voss said very carefully is the main effort. Assessor Thane Morek was not a military person. She had spent her career studying civilizations, cataloging behaviors, building the cultural frameworks that the Conclave's integration teams used to smooth the absorption process. She was methodical, patient, and deeply disinclined toward drama. She had also, in the past 4 hours, not slept, not eaten, and had developed a persistent physical tremor in her secondary hands that she was working very hard to ignore. She met Voss in the forward observation bay because he had asked her to, and she began without preamble, because she had spent the last 40 minutes rehearsing how to say this. The humans aren't fighting the invasion, she said. They're documenting it. Voss looked at her. Every engagement, every structure we've entered, every conversation, every order we've given, every decision your command staff has made in the past 6 hours. Their civilian networks have been recording everything. Not for propaganda, I've analyzed the distribution patterns and they don't match broadcast behavior. They're compiling it, archiving it. She pulled up a data overlay. Every planetary communication node they control is transmitting a continuous signal outward, not to us. Not to any local receiver. Outward, Voss repeated. Into the relay network, Thane said. The deep relay network. Commander, they've been broadcasting to the wider galactic community since hour one. Everything we've done here, every engagement, every order, every structure we've damaged, has been transmitted in real time to every relay station within range. The silence on the observation deck was the specific quality of silence that follows a statement that cannot be unheard. They're showing everyone, Reith said. Every species in range of the relay network, Thane confirmed. Which, given the relay infrastructure in this arm of the galaxy, is approximately 460 species. Including, sir, she paused, because what she was about to say needed a pause, including the 11 conclave member species who have been reconsidering their membership status for the past 2 administrative cycles. Voss set the needle down on the observation railing. He had been carrying it for 5 hours. He hadn't realized until this moment that his hand had been closed around it the entire time. They knew, he said. They knew we would win militarily. Yes. They knew we would pacify them. Yes. So they didn't try to stop it. He looked out at the planet below. Blue and white, coastal light patterns just becoming visible as the Terminator line crept across the eastern continent. They tried to make sure everyone was watching while it happened. Thane was quiet for a moment. There's something else. She brought up another overlay. The recording that's being broadcast, it's not raw footage, it's been edited, in real time, sir, by thousands of contributors simultaneously. The humans have been constructing a coherent narrative of the invasion as it occurs, cross-referencing our actions against their own legal and philosophical frameworks, and broadcasting it with cultural context annotations in 17 different galactic standard translation formats. Voss stared at her. They've been filing the equivalent of a war crimes brief, Thane said flatly, since approximately 40 minutes after your first strike. Voss called a full command pause at hour 6. Every ground team, every engagement sector, every advance unit, complete halt. His senior staff assembled in the forward bay and looked at him with the particular expression of people who had begun to suspect that something had gone profoundly wrong, but hadn't yet been told how wrong. He told them. He watched the expressions change. Senior Tactical Officer HFY Vel was the first to speak, and she didn't speak carefully. It's theater, she said. The whole thing. The line, the civilians working, the music, the soldiers who wouldn't retreat, it's all been theater. Everything we've observed has been part of the broadcast. Not theater, Thane said, from the corner where she had remained. Theater implies they were performing for us. They weren't performing for us. Then what? They were performing for the 460 species watching. Thane brought up the relay distribution map. Look at the timestamps. The human military units chose engagement positions that provided the clearest visual sightlines for overhead sensor capture. They knew exactly where our surveillance drones were. They positioned themselves to be seen clearly by those drones while they held their ground. They were making sure the broadcast had footage. The room went very still. The soldiers, HFY said slowly, who held their positions and died instead of retreating. We're making sure it was visible, Thane said. Yes. They died, Reith said, to make the footage more compelling. They died, Voss said, and his voice was very flat, because they calculated that their deaths, captured and broadcast, would be worth more than their survival. He picked up the needle again. It had gone cold now. What does this do to us? HFY asked. The broadcast. If 460 species have been watching this for 6 hours, what does it actually do? We've pacified worlds before. The Conclave's legitimacy isn't. 11 member species, Thane said quietly. Currently undecided on continued membership. 3 of those 11 have historical grievances against Conclave pacification campaigns. All 3 of those 3 have populations that have been watching this broadcast for 6 hours alongside commentary from human cultural context annotators, explaining every action we've taken in language those species populations understand emotionally. She brought up the secondary relay data, real-time sentiment monitoring, pulled from those 11 species-owned communication networks. The numbers did not require explanation. They're not going to fight us either, Voss said. Those 11 species, they're not going to mobilize a fleet, they're not going to send warships. That's not what this does. He looked at the data. This is economic, political, legal. They're going to begin formal proceedings, request Conclave Council review, file objections. The whole administrative apparatus, the same apparatus we've used to legitimize every pacification campaign for 400 years. The humans are about to turn it around and use it on us. And if they do, Atraz said, very quietly, if even 3 of those 11 species formally request council review of this campaign, based on documented broadcast evidence. The campaign has to halt, Reith said. Pending review, that's the charter. Everyone looked at each other. How long, Voss said, would it take us to complete pacification if we move now? Maximum force, no holds. Atraz checked her numbers. 6 hours, maybe 8. And the broadcast has been running for 6 hours, Voss said. So we already have 6 hours of footage in the relay network. Completing the campaign in maximum force mode would add 8 more hours of footage. 14 total hours of Conclave forces pacifying a pre-unified Category 7 civilization against 0 effective military resistance, while that civilization's population visibly and calmly took care of each other and documented everything we did. He paused, while their soldiers died on camera rather than retreat. He set the needle down one more time. Reith, what's the single most efficient path to ending this engagement? Reith blinked. Sir, ending the engagement is not the same as. I know what I said. The communication that ended the Dominion Conclave's campaign against Earth was transmitted at hour 6, 43 minutes after the initial strike package had begun. It came not from the human government. There were 3 separate human governments claiming authority over the relevant territory, which had been part of the Conclave's original confidence in the 11-day timeline, but from a single human administrator, the same one who had asked Dara's strike team to use the other hallway. Her name was Dr. Amara Osaibansu. She was the Regional Director of Emergency Preparedness for the Eastern Continental Administration, a position that the Conclave's intelligence files had rated as having negligible strategic significance. She sent a written document, not a transmission, not a broadcast, a physical document printed on pressed plant fiber delivered by a human courier to Dara's position on foot. Dara had transmitted it up the chain of command with a notation that read, "I don't know what this is, but I think you need to see it." It was a formal cease and desist notice. Specifically, it cited the Conclave's own administrative charter, Section 91, Subsection 4, Clause 17, the provision preventing member entities from conducting forcible integration of civilizations that had demonstrated, quote, coherent civic infrastructure capable of autonomous resource distribution under crisis conditions. Dr. Osaibansu had apparently found that clause. The 600,000 people in the field, the supply line that had been running for 6 hours through an active invasion, met the documented threshold for coherent civic infrastructure by a factor that Thane Morak calculated in a brief she filed 11 minutes later as unambiguous. She planned this, Voss said, Not the soldiers, not the broadcasts, her. She knew about the charter clause. Thane nodded. How long has she known? Thane checked the document metadata. The file was created, she said carefully, 14 months ago. 14 months before the Armada had even been assembled. The humans hadn't known the Conclave was coming for 14 months. Their long-range sensor capability didn't extend that far. But they had, apparently, begun studying the Conclave's administrative charter, the document that governed everything the Conclave did, the legal framework that 400 years of civilizational supremacy rested on, and they had found the clause, and they had built an entire response infrastructure around it, and they had waited. The supply line, Voss said slowly, was built to be witnessed, Thane said, and documented and transmitted as proof of the clause threshold. She paused. The music, the people working in the administrative buildings, the soldiers who held their positions, all of it was captured in the broadcast, which is now archived in the relay network, which means it is now permanent galactic record of Earth's civic infrastructure functioning under invasion conditions. They didn't fight us, Reith said. They didn't need to, Thane said. They needed us to fight them, Voss said. He looked at the needle one last time. He understood it now. It wasn't detritus. It was specific, a sewing needle, he realized, finally processing the object for what it was. In one of the administrative building feeds visible in the background of the camera footage his team had captured, there had been a human woman seated at a table sewing. In the middle of the invasion, repairing something, making something last longer. Not shock, not dissociation, not ritual. She had simply had work to do, and she had done it. And somewhere in that action, in the absolute unshakable commitment to continuing, was the thing Voss had spent 6 hours trying to name and hadn't been able to. He had an approximate translation for it now, assembled from fragments of the human broadcast's cultural context annotations, cross-referenced with the 14-month-old charter document and the 40 kilometers of people standing in a field and the soldiers who had chosen a camera angle before they chose a fighting position. The closest conclave administrative language equivalent was a phrase that combined concepts of the act of continuing past the point where continuation is rational, the assumption that there will be a tomorrow that needs to be ready, and the refusal to allow an ending to be written by anyone other than yourself. It still wasn't quite right. It was, perhaps, the best translation that could exist. Voss transmitted the withdrawal order at hour 7. Full Armada, all sectors, phased withdrawal to deep orbit pending formal administrative review. He filed the withdrawal under Charter Section 91, Subsection 4, Clause 17, which meant the pacification campaign was not defeated in any military sense. It was suspended on procedural grounds, which would take conclave administrative review approximately 3 years to resolve, during which the Armada was legally obligated to maintain non-interference posture. 3 years. Atraz had pointed out, very carefully, that the humans would not waste those 3 years. Voss had said, I know. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say in a command brief to a staff who were already shaken, was what else he had found in the relay broadcast data, buried in the timestamp logs, something that Thane Morak had noticed and then, with characteristic precision, waited until everyone else had left the room before she told him. The broadcast had not begun at hour 1 of the invasion. The broadcast had begun 22 hours before the invasion, before the first conclave ship had crossed into human space, before any action had been taken, before anyone on Earth could have confirmed that the Armada was actually coming. The humans had begun broadcasting to the galactic community 22 hours before the first shot was fired, with a simple, direct, formally translated statement that had been playing on loop since then in 17 galactic standard language formats, alongside every frame of invasion footage, underneath every cultural context annotation, like a timestamp on a document, like a date on a legal filing, like a needle left in the center of a debris field. The statement read, "We know what you are going to do. We are making sure everyone else does too. We have already arranged what comes after. We are not afraid. We have never stopped." The Armada withdrew. The 3-year review began. The 11 undecided conclave member species, reviewing 14 hours of broadcast footage, alongside a pre-existing legal brief that was both technically flawless and emotionally devastating to every galactic community that had ever experienced a pacification campaign, moved their formal objections to the top of the council agenda. Dr. Amara Osaibansu was appointed to attend the first review session. She arrived with printed documents on pressed plant fiber. She sat down across from the conclave's senior legal administrators, beings who had governed an interstellar civilization for 4 centuries, and she folded her hands on the table, and she looked at them with the specific expression of someone who had been ready for this meeting for 14 months. "Section 91, she said, "let's start there." The war lasted 1 day. The aftermath lasted longer. What no member of the Conclave's Strategic Council had been willing to fully process, even after reviewing the broadcast evidence, even after the legal proceedings began, what remained unresolved in Voss's memory long after he had filed his after-action report, been reassigned, and spent 3 quiet years reading the manuscripts he had brought to Earth and never opened, was not the strategy. The strategy was comprehensible, brilliant in its way. The Conclave had faced adversaries with brilliant strategies before. What remained was smaller than that. It was the woman sewing, the elderly man with the stringed instrument, the 47 people working in the administrative building without being asked, without being ordered, without knowing how long the invasion would last or whether the building would still be standing the next morning. It was 600,000 people in a field, hands full of medicine and food and letters, doing the thing that needed to be done. It was 34 military units that had done the math, had genuinely, rationally, consciously understood that they could not win the engagement they were in, and had chosen their positions anyway, because the math they were doing was not the same math the Conclave had been doing. The Conclave had been calculating odds of victory. The humans had been calculating something else entirely, something the Conclave's administrative language still didn't have a clean word for, though 3 years of legal proceedings had required that word to be invented. The translation team eventually settled on a compound phrase. It was awkward in any galactic standard dialect, but it was the closest they could get. It meant approximately the decision to act as though tomorrow is certain in order to make it so. The Conclave in 400 years had never encountered a species that operated on that assumption so completely, so collectively, so without apparent hierarchy or central command. Every other civilization they had absorbed had, at some point, looked at the overwhelming force arrayed against them and made a rational calculation and adjusted, changed, bent. The humans had looked at the overwhelming force and started sewing, had started singing, had started passing food to each other down a 60-kilometer line in a field, had started building the legal case that would take 3 years to adjudicate, but had been ready and waiting before the first shot was ever fired. The Conclave had been certain, watching this, that it was a tactic, a strategy, a calculated performance designed to achieve a specific outcome. It took 3 years before Voss could articulate, even to himself, why that interpretation was incomplete. The humans weren't performing continuity. They simply continued. The way a river continues around a stone, the way fire continues in a new direction when the wind changes, not because they had calculated that continuation was optimal, not because a command structure had ordered it, but because the alternative, stopping, breaking, accepting an ending written by someone else, was not something they had apparently configured themselves to do. They were not, Voss had finally concluded, the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were not the most advanced, not the most ancient, not the most strategically sophisticated, though they were more sophisticated than the Conclave had ever bothered to check. They were the species that had looked at a civilization 400 years old, with an armada that hadn't lost a campaign in living memory, with legal and military and administrative infrastructure so vast and entrenched that no one had seriously questioned it in generations, and had decided, 14 months before that armada arrived, to simply keep going, to document everything, to feed each other, to play music in the rubble, to file the paperwork, to be still and visible and unbroken in front of 460 watching civilizations, to be the stone that the river had to go around, to make it so obvious, so undeniable, so permanently recorded in the relay network that even the Conclave's most loyal members had looked at the footage and felt, for the first time, the sensation that their administrative language didn't have a word for either. The sensation that they were, perhaps, the ones who hadn't understood something. The sensation that the thing they hadn't understood had been there the whole time. Warm in the wreckage, small enough to hold in 2 fingers, patient enough to